Hey, welcome to your second unit for grade 12 pre-cal. Before we actually dive into our official lessons, this we'll call lesson 0, and these are basically need to know functions that you should be familiar with their shapes before we move on. So instead of having you create them, they're just available to you here to refer back to. So we've got the linear function, which is just f of x equals x. So just plain old y equals x is another way of looking at it, but just x all on its lonesome. Okay, our quadratic, again, is just x squared, so that would have been one that you worked with a lot in grade 11. The cubic function is something that might be a little new. Okay, so this shape is very, very similar to a quadratic, except one side is flipped downwards because, again, if we're dealing with something like -1 cubed, my answer will be -1 still. So keeping that negative around changes that left-hand side of my graph. Okay, so we get this kind of weird sort of snake. Square root functions don't go below 0 in this form. So we can take the square root of 0 is 0, but we can't take the square root of a negative number. Okay, so it does not exist. So that's why our graph only starts from here and goes upward. Okay, and be conscious because there's no negative sign out here, we're only going to talk about positive roots. The second that we introduce this negative out front, that's when we get our reflections that we saw in the previous unit, and we're going to talk a lot more about in this unit. Absolute value functions, so you should have seen these again last year, always go from 0 and they're straight lines because we've got that x function inside. So as if it had been a straight line, but then made positive instead. So we get that very steep specific point here, whereas we get that rounded curve at a vertex for quadratics. And then rational functions, again, ideally you should have seen these last year. And our parent function is just 1 over x. Nothing funny going on in the bottom. My only non-permissible values would be x equals 0. So that's kind of what we're seeing. These are our parent functions. If you want to pause the video right now, take a second, identify the range and domain, because that's something that we're going to be talking about a lot in this unit. So it's good practice to just warm up your brains and remember what the domain and range are for these parent functions as well. Again, parent functions are like the very rudimentary definitions of each of these functions, so trying to keep them as bare as possible. So our domain and range, I've written them in a couple different formats. So these first two I've done in interval notation. That's my personal preference. That's where I'm going to default to a lot of the time. But I also have used set notation here so that if you are leaning towards using set notation, that's totally fine with me. I accept both. It's good to be at least versed enough in both to be able to read them. The key thing to note is that if you do have any restrictions and you're using set notation, that you do always write that first piece. The y and the x are the element of the real. So that means they can be any real number except for within these restrictions. So that's why we got to be conscious when we're using this notation. In the last one for rational functions, I did both because depending on what your preference is. This is the one place that I personally prefer set notation, so the first one over interval notation, and the reason is it's just I find it's maybe not less writing but just more clear, a little bit cleaner. So it says x is an element of the reals where x cannot be 0, but I can write it in interval notation saying x exists from negative infinity to 0 but not including 0, and that's united with starting at 0, but not including the 0, all the way up to positive infinity. And we see that again with our range. So again, either way is acceptable. Both should be at least vaguely familiar with you enough to like read it if you had to, write it if you had to. I know that the majority of the assignment questions that you're going to come across for the online assignments are going to be in set notation, but you will have some interval notation. It just depends kind of on like where I'm pulling my resources from. So just a heads up on that. That'll give you some practice, and I'll try and provide that opportunity in your worksheets as well. But yeah, so those are our parent functions. Those are the big ones, the big 6 that you want to be responsible for, in addition to obviously cosine, sine, and tangent from our previous unit. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, again, domain and range are going to be big pieces of this unit in addition to the general equations of these functions. So you want to be familiar with them. You want to be comfortable writing domain and range. If you need extra practice on that front, please just send me an email and I'm more than happy to provide that for individual students.